that is not possible. The only way you can get returns or add on the money is to profit on trade of goods or charge of providing services. So it's really profit. So here what you have is interest, here what you have is profit. Here interest will be always guaranteed. You will definitely get interest. Maybe the interest rates go down, you get a little less interest. Here you can get profit, but depending on things you can also incur loss. So the interest charge even if the organization suffers losses. So business is doing badly, but because you invested money you get it. But under the profit and loss scheme, in case of losses, the bank will share these losses. So bank therefore has to be careful in terms of what kind of investments it makes. We'll come to that in a little while, because they are not just playing with the money of the investors, they're also sharing in the profit and loss. So in conventional banking, it's all about monetary transactions. Whereas, as you will see, under Islamic finance, there are agreements for exchange of goods and services. So when you're disbursing funds, and this differs. But by and large, as we will see, it is not that you're just a creditor and a debtor, but you're actually partners, you're investors, and so on. So conventional banks use money as a commodity, whereas the important thing about Islamic finance, and I must stress this, is because it is based on real trade-related activities. So real economic system. Now, remember why we had the economic crashes of various points of time, including the financial crisis recently. It's because money was being traded. I mean, some of you who know the Basel II and Basel III requirements know that there is an asset proportion ratio. But a majority, in fact, in the United States, it's estimated that only 3% of all financial transactions are based on real productive, work or economy. All the others is money just being traded. In Islamic finance, because of the asset aspect of it, whether it's asset backed or asset based, then it is related to actual assets, actual trade, and thereby contributes to economic development. So you can actually see it happening. So therefore, think about this. So in conventional banking, money, there is a loan. Now, an Islamic bank cannot issue a loan. A loan is when you go to a bank, ask it for money, and then you borrow the money, you're the borrower, and the bank gives you money, and over a period of time you repay that the loan through interest. That's not permissible in Islam. The only loan really permitted is Hadd Hasana. That's a beneficial or benevolent loan, as we call it. Because, and this is the reason why some of the Islamic contract structures are different, and also the Sukuk. The relationship that you have under Islamic finance is the bank and the client is as partners, investors, traders, buyers and sellers. So what comes between a bank and the borrower is not just money, but it is in fact goods and services. So when you speak about Sharia compliance, you're not merely talking about absence of interest. You're talking about a very clear difference of ethos, principles, and therefore it's a structure. So, and these have to be looked at very clearly. Now what happened is that in 2008, Sheikh Taqi Usmani, who was one of a well-known scholar, was worried about Sukuk structures. So he said that, I think that the Sharia structures are mimicking the Islamic bond structures so much that there is no real difference between them. And in 2008, the Sharia Sukuk market went through a sort of a crisis because people were suddenly worried if, in fact, such a well-known scholar is questioning whether Sukuks are Sharia compliant. Are they? Then Aufi came up with a clear guidelines and clarification as to whether it was permissible or not. Now, musharaka, which as you know comes from the word shariq or partnership, or mudaraba, which comes from the word mudarib or a manager, both these structures were very, very popular. So these are Sukuk structures that are the most popular. But once the Aufi issued the clarification, saying yes, they are allowed, but they can't do certain things, the question in people's mind about the Sharia compliance is so great that the popularity of these two actually dropped. So you can see the correlation between the two. So there the issue was, can let's say in Ijara Sukuk, can you actually have an agreement to buy back the Sukuk asset at their face value? Think about it. So what happens in a typical Ijara Sukuk is that, let's say the government has an asset, let's say a property, and there is an SPV on behalf of the investors, buys that, whether it's asset backed or asset based, don't worry about it, but they purchase it. There is often another parallel agreement for repurchase. So that repurchase was usually at face value. But because in Islam, it prohibited mandatory interest-free loans or liquid facilities that are typically used to make up for any shortfalls in income or underlying Sukuk assets, it said that this is something we're going to deal with later, but I'm just explaining to you that the Sharia compliance meant that you couldn't do certain things. For example, you couldn't repurchase something at just its value because very obviously you need to think about an asset that over a period of time, let's say 3 years, would either go up or down, and therefore the real market value through the profit and loss sharing would have to be taken into consideration. So the issues in Sharia compliance is one of letter and the spirit of the Sharia. So many of these Sharia scholars will talk about the technical aspect, what is possible, what is not possible. But some of the most remarkable and well-established Sharia scholars are those who look at the maqasid, look at the spirit, look at the intention of Islam and what can be achieved. And the Sukuk has been innovative in both ways, being pragmatic, but also more importantly, in trying to promote the essence of Islamic pro-trade activities. So you could, and that's a question which you had asked, you have the form of Islamic Sharia, but you have the substance. You can be original and innovative, but is it catering to the basic principles of Islamic finance? Now, one of the challenges you have, of course, is that if many of these Sukuk products, Islamic finance products that come into the market are not explained properly or they are dubious, then investor confidence actually drops. And the reason why in Indonesia you do not have such a big market share, 25%, as compared to Malaysia, which is many times over, is because more efforts needs to be taken to demystify, which means it appears too complicated, it appears to be very incomprehensible, but also people's understanding of how the National Sharia Board works, how the OJK or the Bank of Indonesia invest. Now think of, for example, halal meat. I'm sure all of you have halal meat. Do you go to the butcher shop and check out whether it is halal meat? No. You take halal meat because you know whom you're buying it from and if there is a stamp for the process. With Sharia compliant finance or Sharia finance, that is important. People are looking at whether the government of Indonesia, whether the National Sharia Board and OJK and Bank of Indonesia all agree with the integrity of the process. If that is done, then everything is taken care of. And therefore the role of OJK is also to ensure, one, that is happening, and the other is to communicate with the people itself. I'm now just going to go on to the next part of this session, which is why is it that some structures work better than the others? So you know that there are a number of Sukuk options in the market. I'm talking about Sukuk structures. You know that there is Mudaraba, Musharaka, Murabaha, Ijara, Salam, Istisna, Makala, and of course the hybrid, which we will talk a little bit about. These are all Sukuk structures. We're going to explain this later tomorrow. But on all these options, it's very confusing to people. And also, there are so many options. The question arises, why are there so many? Well, in some ways, it's a positive thing because when you go into the market, you need to be able to choose. But it's not so much as if the investors get to choose. It's really the issuer, the originator, who decide what is the appropriate Sukuk structure for the market itself. And what they essentially do is, remember, the Sukuk is nothing but a composition of, on one hand, the Islamic contract which is chosen. So therefore we talk about something which is a wakala sukuk or an ijara sukuk. And the second thing is the underlying asset. So a sukuk is made of three things. It's made of which contract, which asset, and the third is the relationship and the rules that are there. So my objective is to look at, in fact, why and how these choices are actually made. Now Indonesia is quite a remarkable experience because it has the diversity of products that are there. What you already know is that globally the sukuks are dominated by sovereign sukuks, and 80% of all sukuks were sovereign sukuks. So what you're talking here is that the originator / issuer are really the states. So therefore the number of corporate sukuks are relatively limited, and we'll see the reason for that. I mean, first of all, there is a very high cost of issuing. You not only need all the documentation, but you also need a lot of expertise. And remember, we use the term critical mass. The reason why Malaysia is able to do it is because it's mastered the art, and it doesn't require that much of time to do it. It's able to do it quickly, and it's able to do many of them, and able to do big ones of them. But Indonesia is quite a innovator and best practice when it comes to not just sovereign sukuks, and since 2010, look at every year, it's been oversubscribed, and there's a high demand for its international global sukuk, but also its domestic sukuk. The important thing is that its retail sukuk, which is 1.67 billion, is one of the largest sukuks and issued on a regular basis since 2008. So when you talk about a sukuk which is a sovereign sukuk or a retail sukuk, you look because it has different objectives, different investors, and there are different structures. The corporate sukuk, since Indosat, we've seen it's been limited, so the share is actually small. It's an area that the government of Indonesia and all of you are looking to improve. But last year, you know what Garuda did, and in order to meet its financial shortfall, it came up with a corporate sukuk of 500 million. A very unconventional one. It was not even created, but still it's quite an interesting, based on the wakala structure, often SPV and so on. So you could have, as you know from what we looked at earlier, a sukuk which is global or aimed at the domestic market, and we need to work a little more on the domestic market as well as the global. Can be based on the rupiah as the dollar, and therefore the issuers, objective assets, and the structures actually vary. So the innovation of structures is important, and one of the ways it's done is through the SPV. We're going to discuss SPV in the afternoon session, by which we mean special purpose vehicle, and the term that is often used is financial engineering. So once you know what is needed, what are the objectives, what are the requirements in terms of the Sharia, then you model the structure in such a way that meets both the integrity of the process, meaning that it does not violate certain Sharia rules, but also meet the investment needs of the investor itself. So therefore the sukuk certificates the sukuk holders have can mean different things. They are certificates which signify a partial ownership, or it can collective or partial ownership either of an asset or its entitlement, and so on and so forth, which we are going to discuss this. And how it work the revenue streams for investment holders. It can be a profit from a sale, a rental, or a contribution of both, and so many others we're going to have a look at. So keep in mind several things. What is the asset, and how can the asset generate the kind of... Let's keep in mind now that who are the people who make the decisions as to which structure is best suited or appropriate. First of all, it's the originators. So, for example, the government, which is the sovereign, is the dominant issuer. Now, remember the kind of problems the government has. The government does not want to lease out its property, or does not want to transfer its property. It has limited, productive assets, meaning it might have airport, but how many times the question came in, they can't use the same asset on different, sukuks, and they might need a variety of different transportation ones. So the state will like to be innovative, and we're going to talk about in the afternoon session how it's not just property, but a whole lot of different innovative assets that are used, like airtime or HUD services, and so on and so forth. The corporate sector is concerned about the high cost of rating, contract documentation, the investment banking, the fees. So they want something that is administratively, economical and workable. You can't have, because in some cases, certainly in Indonesia, the cost of issuing a sukuk can be more than the cost of issuing a bond. It's not so in Malaysia because they do it on a more regular basis, and certainly not. So the Islamic banks have a particular problem. And they have a whole lot of short-term assets, but they might not have the appropriate assets in which they can issue a large number of bonds. So therefore, the consolidation that we're talking about is going to help to generate these kind of consolidated assets on the basis of which you can have most of those. Also remember that when you're talking about investments, there are hedges, there are guarantees, and takaful. You're talking about pension funds, you're talking about insurance funds. Unless all of these funds are actually tapped in terms of assets, in terms of sukuk generation, it's not going to work. And the successful economies have actually done that. So from the point of view of originator, it's both what is the asset that's available, the process, and what are the outcomes that are needed. The investors, remember the investors, we're going to talk about them in terms of the secondary market in the afternoon session. It could be both individual or they can be institutional. And one of the problems is that the institutional investors, namely the banks and others, are dominating the market, certainly as far as the sovereign sukuks are concerned. So the institutional sukuks are competitive, and the big question for them happens to be, why should we take a sukuk rather than a bond? And the approach of the government of Indonesia, Bank Indonesia, is that we will create an equal playing field. That we will treat both the bonds and the sukuk the same way. Of course, in practice, if you're promoting something, you need to create tax incentives or other frameworks and stuff. Now, the remarkable thing about retail banking is that the minimum order is only 5 million rupiah, which is relatively small. So therefore, people who are investing look at whether they can afford to participate, whether they understand the structure, whether it's simple enough, and also whether it's Sharia compliant. So economic aspects of it, affordability, predictability, and the Sharia part. Now the investors, of course, if you look at the profile of who the investors are, I'm talking about Indonesian sukuks. They come from all over the world. I'm talking about the global ones. So there's a good mix of Indian, Asian, Gulf, Western investors, and so on and so forth. But the only problem here happens to be, we will see in our later sessions, that comes at a price, because the SPV as well as the legal system has to be recognizable, or rather it has to be similar to the conventional financing models that are there. So they only think of how is it similar to the convention, what is the predictability, and so on and so forth. Now the sukuk investors, now I'm looking at a brochure from the CIFLAC. He says, who are the people who are interested in buying sukuk? They are likely to be people who have medium or long-term investment horizon. So remember, sukuk can be very short. In some cases, within 6 months, we can see that there are certain institutional investors that can afford to do so, and they need to do so. But by and large, a sukuk can be for a longer period of 3, 5, 10, even longer, and we're also talking about perpetual sukuks, as we will talk tomorrow. They want Sharia compliance, and they want to receive a tax-effective income stream to maintain the value of the investment, and also importantly, they're looking for a less volatile investment which can accept that return will fluctuate over the short term. So stability is going to be important, and we look at why there is so many talk about liquidity issues in the afternoon session. So the five largest issuers of Indonesian Sukuk, as you probably know, not surprisingly, is the Perusahaan, Penelope, Surat, Berhaga, Sierra Negara, Indonesia. That's the issuer. We will talk about that in the afternoon. It's also Bank Indonesia, it's Momlat Indonesia, it's BNI Sierra and Indosat. So the other players, when it comes to deciding what is the structure of the Sukuk that is there, it is of course the originator and the issuer, but it is the underwriters, which are the banks. But if you remember when we talked about the fatwa process, remember the people who are behind the whole process, the lawyers, the Sharia scholars, the credit rating agency, which we'll talk about again in the afternoon, the tax people, the auditors, the regulators. So the creation of a Sukuk is not something that is theoretically done in a room, but involves extension consultations and also a reference to the market demands. And people are learning about what will work and what will not work, because remember that it will be a complete disaster if the government of Indonesia issues a Sukuk that does not work. It will not only hit the investor confidence if it fails, but it will jeopardize future issuances. So one has to be very careful, which is why you don't have too many of them. And I'm going to come and talk about this as a big problem, that the reason for the absence of a secondary market is that there aren't enough issuances, or that there is far greater demand than there's actually supply. So therefore, what are the key considerations? If you're going to choose a Sukuk, which Sukuk will you choose based on who is the issuer and what is it that their priorities are? What are their strengths and what are the problems they want to avoid? How much of money are they raising? So therefore, the size matters. How can we manage it? Who are they targeting? What would be the preferences of the potential investor? What is the tenor? What is the duration? And therefore, what are the kind of arrangements which will make it efficient, but also make it viable and guarantee the outcomes, namely the regular periodic revenue streams and returns, but also the completion of the Sukuk itself. And therefore, the important thing is what is the preferred Sharia structures, and we're going to look at compare them tomorrow. Now, in the year 2014, if you look at it and see what were the structures that were actually preferred, the Murabaha was quite popular. In some cases, 60%. The Murabaha, as you know, Sukuk is based on certificates whereby you mobilize funds for the purpose of purchase of certain commodities. Commodity being a very broad term. Interesting thing is, 15% is Ijara, which is lease back. Musharaka, which is participation, 7%. Wakala, 5%. And then you also have the investment Sukuk and other Sukuks, which are the smallest. The question is, Ijara. In the case of Indonesia, Wakala also preferred, and some Murabaha. Why is this the case? Now in Indonesia, the Sukuks are 68% Ijara. Murabaha is 2% and the others can be varied, they are 30%. This is the 2016 CIFLAC report. And this is very different from Malaysia. In Malaysia, Murabaha is the dominant structure. Whereas in Indonesia, Ijara is the dominant structure. And that's the question for us today, which we're going to look at in some detail. Look, however, at the corporate Sukuk. So if you talk about the sovereign Sukuk, then those are either based on Ijara or Wakala. Mostly. In the case of corporate Sukuk, that is based on Ijara Sukuk, which is again dominant, but also on Mudara, either Mudara or Mudara Sukuk. Also the popularity. Now I want you to think about this because this will be part of our discussion. Why is Ijara popular, not only in Indonesia, but also in other parts of the world. It is the second largest structure of sukuks that's issued. And it's popular because, to start with, it is based on asset. And it is a very well recognized concept of a lease. A lease contract, an ijara contract, is simple, it's extremely well known, it's a classical one, there's no debate about it. There might be some debate about certain controversies, I'll talk about that tomorrow. And it has been endorsed by the Sharia scholars. And because of the fact that the lease, the ijara is very comparable to the financing in conventional bonds, people are able to say, okay, ijara, bond, lease bond. So we can relate to it. So there's a predictability, there's a certainty based on contracts, simple, and therefore it has been quite successful. The question for you is, in the practice of Indonesia, do you think this is really worked out? The trends, if you look at sukuk structures across the world, you will see that there is a trend which is away from risk sharing towards fixed income and debt creating contracts with the structure. So now what's happening, it appears to be that the risk sharing contracts, namely the mudaraba and the musharaka, appears to be going down, whereas others which are based on debt creating and which are less risk sharing seem to be going up. So it's different in different parts of the world, but these are some of the things to consider. So therefore, when we talk about the issues of sukuk, what are the factors that are important already? The first one happens to be what investors want and what the issuer or the originator thinks is the best way of getting revenue back. Because remember, sukuk represents two sides of the coin. On one hand, it is to generate income or capital for the originator, in order that the originator, namely the government of the company, can have more money or funding to finance whatever that originator wants to do. On the other hand, it also creates investment opportunity for new groups or diversified investment opportunities for those who are already in the market. But what kind of sukuk you will issue will depend on what asset you have at your disposal. And something we're going to look at this after. Secondly, pricing is going to be very important. And therefore, how the primary as well as the secondary market actually functions. What is the cost to the issuers, because it has to be viable, it has to be workable, and so on. And remember, the sukuk is primarily, as we'll see in section number 4, a legal process. So the drafting of legal documents is going to be very important. And then it comes to what OJK and others are doing, which is the regulatory framework. How can you ensure that a sukuk that is structured performs in the way it is intended to? That it does not turn out to be the case of theory and practice gap that the friend talked about, that it leads to default or problems. So for a sukuk to actually work, a lot of considerations go to it. So I want to merely explain that we are here thinking about sukuk as a very complex architecture as well as some sort of baseball map. But that's positive because on one hand there must be choice that's available both to the originator in order that they might issue the appropriate one, but also for the investor. But it can be confusing, and that confusion can be taken away by explaining that certain structures can best work in certain conditions or for certain objectives of the sukuk itself. And also remember that innovations are taking place. So when we talk about ijara, the different types of ijara. It depends on the nature of the lease. And there are new innovations that are taking place, and the success of the whole sukuk market is because it sees a remarkable innovations which are not there in some of the other markets, and they will come. And hybrids is one part. Now, if a sukuk can be issued in Indonesia, it can be done so only if it has the supportive legal and regulatory framework, and also the tax structure. What we will see in just the next session or so is that there's one important difference between a Sukuk and a conventional bond. A conventional bond is relatively simple because you are giving money, you get interest, and you take it back. A Sukuk involves multiple transactions and it is based on the calculation of profits or losses. But most importantly, there are many transactions involved. Now think about this. If there are many transactions, particularly there are different transfers of title, each one of those transactions would trigger off tax implications. So whether it be capital gain, income tax, but more importantly, you're talking about stamp duty and so on. But whether something is a real sale or whether it is only meant to facilitate the Sukuk structure needs to be looked at. But do you have the tax structure that supports it? The legal structure. What is the difference between a legal title and a beneficial title? What are you transferring? Are you transferring the complete legal title or just the use of fraud? That's very important. Then, as far as the assets are concerned, you ask what is the nature of the assets? Are they secured? How can you repurchase them? Because in some countries, it's very difficult. You know, my experiences working in the land sector is that it's very difficult to purchase land. It takes a long period of time. So if the whole Sukuk structure is dependent on transfer of property, how quickly can you do it? And that's where the Malaysians have been able to quicken things a little bit. But don't forget governance issues. You could have issues of transparency and corruption, valuing of the property, who is the real owner, and so on and so forth. So when you talk about transfer of title, what are the costs of the transfer, how much time it takes, and what are the implications? What if the government, in order to create a sovereign Sukuk, transfers some important lands? Remember, this is ultimately public property, and it's not able to get it back. Or more importantly, what if that is land? Let's say you're talking about forest land. That gets impaired, that gets destroyed, or that gets spoiled. So, what are the assets and what are the risks that you take? And most importantly, ultimately, if you go back to the definition of what is a Sukuk is meant to be tradable. But remember that all bonds are tradable, but not all Sukuks are tradable. And therefore, the success of the liquidity and the tradability of the Sukuk is going to be important. So this was merely an introduction. We're not talking about the Sukuk itself or the real issues. But you need to understand why we have a large number of Sukuk structures and how decisions in relation to adopting one or the other actually taken. They're based on both Sharia arguments, compliance, as well as economic arguments. But also keep in mind that we are talking about financial governance, financial inclusion. We ultimately must reach to markets, either as retail or even as global, where conventional finance has not gone. Okay, I'm going to stop over there so that we can have an interactive session. I'm happy to respond, but also your contribution.
Thank you, Professor, for the presentation. I have two questions. First, based on your explanation about conventional banking and Islamic banking, I'm just wondering, can the issuer of Sukuk raise funding from their Sukuk issuance higher than their underlying asset value? And the second one is one of the issue on legal and regulatory issue in issuing Sukuk is about the tax treatment. And my question is there any difference or implication on tax between Sukuk, which is asset-based, and asset-backed? Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity, sir. I'm Nia from OJD, and I like to ask two questions. In your slide that you mentioned before, there is a tawarruk scheme, right, in Sukuk insurance. Is it tawarruk Sukuk? Is it tawarruk Sukuk similar with by Al-Ina Sukuk? And if it does similar, I think Indonesia is still not allowing this kind of sukuk to use in our sukuk. And why does the other country use this kind of sukuk? Because you know that sukuk apa sih? Tawaruk scheme is like prohibited in Islam. By Alina is prohibited in Islam. And the second is because you are from UK, I like to know about Sharia scholar in UK and how deep is the role of Sharia scholars in UK, any issue on sukuk in UK. Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Ibrahim. I am a journalist from myselling.co. I have two questions. First, we have Indonesia is one of the prominent player in sukuk industry all around the world. And you said before, Malaysia mastered the arts for creating all kind of sukuk, even for the big one. Malaysia easily engineer it and quickly. So, in your opinion, what needs to be done for Indonesia to be like Malaysia? It means to master the arts in creating sukuk, especially in terms of human capital development. The second, what is better for Indonesia, the sovereign sukuk or the retail one? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very good question. I think I'm learning a lot as we go along. The first question was that could we have a higher pricing and yield than the actual value of the asset itself? Two things. So when you talk about Islamic financing, you're talking about full disclosure. So the nature of the asset and its valuation has to be done professional. It has to actually be proved because this goes right into the question of credit rating. But also, more importantly, the financials, the banks and others would like to look at whether it is financially viable and whether it can generate the kind of revenue. So when you talk about the value of the asset and you're talking about the pricing and the yield, two things are important. One is the value of the asset at the beginning, the starting of the sukuk and at the end of the sukuk period, but more importantly, the revenue streams. So the answer to that will depend on a case-to-case basis, but ultimately this is something that the regulators will have to look at because otherwise it will become too risky and might jeopardize a whole lot of people. The second important question was, is there a difference in terms of tax treatment for sukuk structure and for those that are asset-based and asset-backed? Now, the fundamental difference between asset-backed and asset-based is, in case of asset-backed, there is a real, or what we call a true sale. So the legal title, let's say, goes from the government to the SPD. So for the duration of the sukuk, the special purpose vehicle owns both the legal as well as the beneficial title. And the way to find out is look at the account books of the government. It will say there's a sale that has taken place and it does not have any beneficial or technical, in fact, it is not there as an asset at all. In the case of asset-based, the asset still remains on the books of the government and therefore it is only the beneficial use is transferred. Why do I say this? The difference between the two is the true sale. So asset-based can involve multiple transactions of legal title. It will transfer one to the other and go. And the tax implications of that are enormous because the transfer of the legal title, which goes from here and there, can lead to stamp duty, capital gains tax, and so on and so forth. Asset-based, on the other hand, does not involve a true sale, and therefore in most countries discounted. So how did the United Kingdom actually promote Sharia mortgages and other things like that? Because it ignores some of the sales or the transfers that take place as being short of true sale and therefore are not taxed. Yes, so therefore you can actually have a transfer, but for tax purposes not considered to be a true sale, and therefore it's not taxed. So therefore there are no multiple taxation. It is determined by the taxation structure of a country as to which would amount to a taxable true sale and one which would not. Yep. Okay, we'll discuss this in further detail. As far as the question on tabarruk is concerned, I thought that was a very good question, because it is true that it is disfavored in Indonesia as compared to some of the other countries for very obvious reasons. Remember that I'm going to just answer the third question. It says, how can Indonesia become like Malaysia? Indonesia does not want to become, does not need to become like Malaysia. Malaysia has chosen a particular kind of an approach in terms of interpretation of what is permissible under Islamic finance. You take, for example, receivables. So in many parts of the world, receivables are not considered as assets because they are in fact financial assets, they're not real assets. But a liberal interpretation, as we will see in the next session, recognizes the receivables in Malaysia, and it's a liberal market. In Indonesia, the Sharia scholars might not recognize tabarruk, which is fine because there are other options that are available. And that leads to the question of Sharia scholars in the United Kingdom. I had the privilege of, in fact, supervising from a PhD several Sharia scholars. Now, this is and who are very knowledgeable, who are trained very often in maybe Al-Azhar or from Lebanon, who have a very global perspective. So these Sharia scholars are ones who understand Sukuk and Islamic finance products across the world, who are usually members of the AOFI and so on and so forth. The AOFI member has members from all over the world. Now, as I pointed out, the fundamental difference between, let's say, UK and many of the Gulf countries happens to be that they are individual Sharia scholars that are part of banks. So that's because it's not Islamic countries or because it's decentralized in terms of product development. So then what happens is, in terms of getting a sukuk developed, you actually refer the product to the Sharia committee, Sharia board. I'm talking about banks Sharia board, and they either approve or disapprove of it. If they disapprove, you probably want to do something else, and so on. So that's the UK effort. The UK effort, or the initiative, or the structure happens to be each bank has its own Sharia scholars. But many countries in the world are now moving towards having a national Sharia board which takes common decisions. And so if a bank wants to develop a product, or a sukuk originator or issuer wants to come up with a product, it will have to be cleared not with that individual bank or the company or whatever it is. It will have to be cleared by the national board, which of course is important, because remember that sukuks that are private sukuks don't even need to be listed, or they can be private sukuks. But if you have a public listing or you have a public sukuk, the people have a right to know, and part of the documentation and the disclosure is not only in relation to the Sharia compliance, but also in terms of the process of how this is achieved. And again, my example of the halal meat is important. People need to know, one, who has given that certification, and two is, what does that mean? Right? Okay, the third one, very good question. Thank you very much, because I know that you being part of media are following all the political and the economic debates. I think that you are very right. The ultimate reason why Malaysia has been able to move forward is not merely because of product innovation or leadership, but because of human capital. Getting a pool of talent is important. So if you're going to wage a war, or you're going to have a project, you must think about how many people does it actually involve. So you need 10,000 project people or 10,000 soldiers. The same way, if the ambition of Indonesia happens to be to move from 5% to, let's say, 10% or 15%, do you have the manpower in terms of expertise who are able to step up to that? What government of Malaysia did was it prioritized hundreds, it set up institutions, it got people to have these collaborations. So I think I completely agree with you. The challenge that Indonesia faces in terms of Islamic finance is not the regulatory framework. It's doing very well at that. Not the political support, but it is in the area of human capital, which all of us are responsible. As far as innovation is concerned, I wanted to say what is innovative and what is permissible are two entirely different things. And what will work for Indonesia is very different. I think most my Indonesian colleagues do not like comparison with Malaysia because they say Malaysia is a very different country which has chosen its priorities. It did so for its own reasons at a particular point of time. The time is right for Indonesia and it's got its own vision, and therefore what the Bank in Indonesia, OJK, National Sharia Board are doing in terms of its consensus is very important. And I think the success of Indonesian Sukuk generally and its growth reflects the global confidence in Indonesia. The reason why the British Embassy is supporting this is because it knows Indonesia is going to be the next leader when it comes to Islam. Okay, I'll stop there and take some more questions if you have.
I have two questions, sir.
I like the fact that everybody has two questions.
As we know that our National Sharia Board is an independent organization. It means separate with our regulator like OJK and Bank Indonesia. And in Malaysia, as you know that Sharia Board is a part of the regulation. It's like in Bank Negara Malaysia or in Sharia Commission. Securities Commission, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And in your opinion, sir, which model is better about our Sharia Board? And then the second is, in your presentation in 2014 maybe, major of Sukuk is about murabaha. That's why it means the underlying asset of murabaha is community. My question is it real community or the community is only about, is for a vehicle? It's only about vehicle is community. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chef. Continuing the discussions about the taxation, could you explain to me a little bit about the concept of AFIP? If I'm not mistaken, UK have the concept of AFIP, Alternative Finance Investment Bond, and how can the concept coined by the UK regulators bring equal tax treatment between the conventional bond and the Sukuk? And is that concept are feasible to be applied in Indonesia, which is a civil law country? Thank you.
Okay, let me respond to both. First of all, thank you very much. I intended to say this. The approach of Indonesia in having an independent board, of course it's part of the broader Majlis. The National Sharia Board is actually an excellent practice. It's excellent practice because it's not just an independent committee on its own, because then there are problems arising out of, I'm just going to go back to this. So whenever we refer to the National Sharia Board, we know where it comes from, and therefore so the National Sharia Board in Indonesia has the twin advantages. On one hand, it's independent from OJK, so it will provide independent, robust experience. On the other hand, it is not just another committee which can be influenced. It's part of the broader Islamic institutions that exist. So I actually think that compared to the Malaysian approach, where the Sharia Board is part of the Securities Commission, the Indonesian experience is much more better. Of course, one of the things is the coordination that exists between, let's say, OJK, Bank of Indonesia, and the National Sharia Board, which is why the 2014 Memorandum of Understanding that you have between the National Sharia Board and OJK is very important. Events where there's better coordination. So I think that this coordination works very, very well, and I think it's quite positive. I'm also grateful to you to point out that one of the problems with the Murabaha and its success happens to be that when you talk about a commodity, it might not be broad based. We know that Islamic finance in Indonesia is largely focused on financing of vehicles and other things like that. But think of commodity, Muraba commodity as a much more broader approach which can be used in a variety of setups. So we'll discuss this a little bit in detail tomorrow. I'm also suggesting that we save the question on the taxation to session 4 because we are going to be looking at taxation structures a little more in detail. So unless you recognize what is the transfer of asset and then we will look at the alternative financing and taxation process.